Hello, fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today I am joined by Richard from Vintage SF and finally Stephen E. Andrews from the Outlaw Bookseller. We've been wanting to chat with each other for quite a while, so I'm very happy to have you on, Steve. And of course, Richard, I'm glad to see you again, and I think we'll be doing this again tomorrow live, right?
That's right. I'm joining you for what?
Yeah, it won't be tomorrow for the viewers, but yeah,
true.
We're recording this on Monday the 5th, so this is a continuation of a video that started over on Richard Rempel's channel. We're talking about Christopher Priest's first novel, Indoctrinaire. And we're going to be doing a bit more of a plot-spoiling deep read in this conversation. So it would be wise, if you haven't watched Richard Rempel's video, to go over there and watch that one first, and then come back to this one, because his is non-plot spoiling review. And here we are going to definitely be talking about some spoilers. All right. Well, thank you guys both for joining me. So right away, what I like to do with these books is talk about the titles, and I think this has a really unique title, Indoctrinaire. I don't think that is, I think he made up that word. When I do a search for it, all that comes up is this novel, and I was wondering if you guys have any ideas how it kind of linked to you, to the actual story.
He said that he couldn't remember why he called it Indoctrinaire. And
it's in an afterword here in this book.
I don't have an afterword, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And something he said was he couldn't remember why he called it that. But clearly there's moments in the plot early on in the interrogation section where you may get the feeling that Wentic is being indoctrinated, that he's being exposed to something. And he's being put through all these tests, like when he crawls through the maze shed, when he's subjected to the audiovisual torture, all those things. And that to me seemed to be, well, okay, what are they doing with Wentic? Are they trying to break him? If they're trying to break him, what are they trying to discover? How is he deemed to be responsible? Why has he become a target? So you're seeing it that way. Of course, Indoctrinaire is also, if you take away the prefix, is doctrinaire, and of course look up the meaning of the word doctrinaire. That has some significance as well, because I think one thing about this book is that in that opening sequence, at the, what do they call it, not the contingency, the ATC
concentration
is very, very much, that seems like that's a secret place, based deep under the Antarctic, which is 30 miles in all its corridors, and it took 10 years to build. And Wentic is doing this work. And, I don't know how known it was then, but I always think when I've read this about, the secret history, it hasn't been a secret for a long time, of LSD and the way that CIA ran MK Ultra, and they gave people LSD without them knowing and what have you. And Wentic is self-administering. And of course, his work is unleashed and has incredible consequences he didn't expect. So I see Wentic in a way as a little bit like Albert Hoffman, the guy who discovered LSD.
Riding his bike?
Riding his bike, and, he was going through those different derivatives of DLSD, and he went back to a certain derivative, the 25th derivative, because he had a peculiar presentiment, which is how he put it. And, he took a tiny dose, and then the famous bike ride took place. And Wentic, it is that thing where he is responsible to a large degree. And this is the thing with science. It is one of the classic science fiction things, isn't it? That people create things, but they don't think about the consequences. And of course, the shadow of the bomb and that Bruce Pennington jacket, really comes across this warlike world. And again, as Richard is showing in the Pan edition there, you've got the implication, you've got the eyeball, which is being ejected, you've got the nuclear flash, and I'm not sure if that covers by Mike Plug, I think it might be. And also there's the prison wall in there. So really, Indoctrinaire is referring in lots of ways to secret research involving chemicals, chemical warfare, those sort of things. So it is very much a book that's confronting those things and using them not just to highlight the horrors of contemporary war. There's a wonderful book by Robert Harris, who wrote Fatherland, which he co-wrote with Jeremy Paxman, who's another journalist from the UK, called A Higher Form of Killing, The Secret History of Gas and Germ Warfare. And it's absolutely terrifying. And, when I read Indoctrinaire, I think of that. But there's also this wonderful thing that leads to the jungles. So Indoctrinaire, there are forces at play in the novel. And sometimes we're not certain who or what they are. And that's all for the better, I feel.
Yeah, what Dr. Wentic, for some odd reason I keep wanting to call him Wetnick, I don't know why, Wentic is researching was very interesting to me, and it was described in a unique way in this book that he was interested in Pavlovian science, that he saw conditioning and wanted to create a chemical that would create a Pavlovian response in recipients instantly. So he was trying to cut it down so that instead of having to continuously break somebody down and then train them to have a Pavlovian response to something, he just wanted to be able to give them a chemical that would instantly put them right where they were ready for that Pavlovian response. And that is very terrifying. And I think that for me, that's kind of how I connected the title Indoctrinaire to this concept that he was creating an LSD-like chemical that did cause hallucinations, because right at the beginning of the book, he's intravenously microdosing himself with this chemical and enjoying the hallucinations and setting himself up to instantly be completely open to some kind of Pavlovian response. And I think that becomes really important in the jail sequence of this novel, this idea of how you break somebody down and then build them up to respond how you want them to respond. Although the absurdity of this novel, I feel, is that they break them down with no idea what they're building them up to, right? As I think you already mentioned, Steve. Yeah, so that's kind of where I went with the title of this. Sorry, Richard, if I interrupted you.
That's okay. I was, there's a couple things I was going to say. One, I just looked up, it's Jeff Taylor who did the artwork for this version here. I'm not very familiar with his work, but I find this a spectacular cover.
Yeah.
What you were mentioning about the breaking down of Dr. Wentic, we haven't really talked a lot about the people who have, there's Indoctrinaire from the Golanx edition that you can presently pick up, correct, Steve?
Yeah, that's in print. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So we haven't really mentioned Strode or Musgrove yet. And those are the two people who come from the United States government or from the Pentagon, at least that's what we're led to believe, to bring him into this zone where you step across 200 years. But in that zone, it's like your mind can't operate the right way. At least that's the way it seems, because it's not only Wentic who goes through these torturous, surrealistic episodes. His jailers as well are losing it. It's like they're all really trapped here, and none of them can really, in the end, make sense of what's happening. And we discovered that one of those guys really is a person from the future who came back as well. Yeah. And that starts to unlock the story. But I'm always amazed at the point where everybody out there, whether you're jailer or prisoner, you're actually all prisoned by the warping of reality in your mind.
Yeah, the disturbances as the after effects of the gas warfare are still there, and everybody seems to be a victim of them. And there is worth making a sort of countercultural point here, which is that I think obviously in the 1960s, mind-altering drugs became a very, very big thing, and an entire generation seemed to have taken them. And maybe Priest was making a comment on the fact that everybody was involved in this, and everybody was a victim of it, and it made society possibly more difficult to cope with. And certainly you get the feeling after a while that it's not just Wentic who is the victim, but there are multiple victims of this, and they all seem to have gone down this rabbit hole. And there's a direct sort of thing there. We say down the rabbit hole, and we think of Lewis Carroll. And the thing that comes to mind is the classic line. Is it the I can't think which one of the characters says it. We're all mad here. At
the Cheshire Cat.
Cheshire Cat says it. That's right. And there's very much that sense. So how much of Indoctrinaire is a comment on the fact that this collective madness seems to have seized, a whole culture? And it's another interesting thing is that the relationship between Chris and Michael Moorcock was quite spiky, and it gives me great pain because Chris is my friend and Mike's my friend, and nevertheless they didn't see eye to eye. And Mike, of course, was more somebody who embraced the counterculture. He was one of the people who was more like one of the architects of it in what he did when he was younger and what he did with New Worlds. And of course, one of his key novels in this period, The Final Program. You read The Final Program, Chris? I think you have.
I have, yeah.
I haven't.
And in this, of course, this is in a fairly groovy near future. But there's a lot of chaos, which is reminiscent of the Vietnam War. And the father of Jerry Cornelius, the central character, and he's off screen because he's dead. He's an expert in hallucinatory devices, and he wanted to create something where people would disassociate in seconds. And that reminds me of what Wentic is doing. And of course, there was a substance by that point where that would happen, DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And that occurs naturally in yahe, the plant which exists up the Amazon, which William Burroughs went in search of in his books, The Yahe Diary and Queer. So there may well be sort of a comment in Indoctrinaire back at the Jerry Cornelius stories, which do have their dark moments, but they have a lot of fun ones as well. And, so I think what Priest is doing is working on a number of levels, and it's this kind of stuff that you can't get from a text until you know somebody, and then you can make the assumptions. And this is why I talk about these, is to stick them out there, because I think they're all valid. And I just flash back to the thing that Chris said to me, which was that I hated the 60s, all those drugs, it was horrible. So maybe he never talked about any such experiences, maybe he didn't have them. My own feeling is that he probably shied away from that sort of thing. But he was a guy with long hair, and what have you. He was one of the crew as well. So in a way,
he was pretty cool in the 60s, actually.
Yeah,
I like his photos from the 60s.
He was always a cool guy. Yeah, very much so. I'll find a picture of him here, which is slightly less cool. And but it's still well worth seeing. It's one of my favorite pictures because he actually looks like Colin Wilson in this. And he wasn't keen on Colin Wilson.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
you don't see that very often, and that's the I think that's the Harper and Row US edition, which is easier to pick up than the UK one. But I think it is easy to read these things in, but that's part of art, isn't it? You read stuff in, and it may not actually be there, but art doesn't happen until the mind of the creator and the audience comes together. And I think he was supremely aware of that. The question is for Indoctrinaire is, how aware are the characters as the narrative unfolds about what's really going on?
Right. Zero.
Yeah. Yeah. They're not even aware of the hole in the zero.
Nice.
Which is another book hardly anybody's got or read apart from, I think, me and Chris and my friend Graham. But there's that thing where he did say that he put those science fiction explanations in, which I guess were kind of necessary. But it would have been nice if he'd done a version where they weren't there. But you can always, when you get familiar with the text, you can always drop them out, of course. But I haven't reread the entire book for this, but I love the opening sequences and the interrogation and the very end part. So we'll go to mega spoilers now, which I absolutely love, where he talks about, let's see, Wentic is sort of waiting there over the plane, and there's the aircraft, and it flips to the UK by that point. Salisbury Plain is mentioned. Salisbury Plain isn't very far from here. It's only about 20 miles from here. And that's where the British government does military exercises. That's where Porton Down, which is our bio-warfare and chemical warfare centre is. There's a great little horror novel that starts off there by a guy called Tim Leben, a Welsh writer, called Berserk, which is well worth reading. And, you know, Wentic is there, and he waits, and he says he settled himself against the trunk of a tree and watched the silver aircraft below. Only as the sun was setting did a man in a lime green cape, and, you know, that suddenly gets very SF now, very Van Vogt, the lime green cape, come to the hatch and look round at the sky, now a deep blue streak with black. He stood looking at it and then went back inside. And half a minute later, the aircraft disappeared. And it's that thing where, when I read that, I find that it's almost like watching a scratchy piece of film, a little bit of UFO footage that might actually be fake, with the lines running down it, the sprockets broken. And I think Chris has really got a cinematic sense. In a lot of this, you can see what's going on. And it's very dramatic. There's a lot of drama in the book, and he didn't shy away from that. And something which flashed into my head earlier on is somebody who I feel he may have influenced, but I don't know this, is Lucius Shepard. Have either of you read Lucius Shepard?
Yes, I have.
You've read Green Eyes, Richard?
I read his vampire book.
Yeah, The Golden. Yeah. And Lucius Shepard's early work is all set in jungles, and there's a lot in there about altered state of consciousness. Yeah. And Shepard, though, is lusher and more like a magical realist, is the cliche, but it's kind of true. And there's, you'd love him, Chris. You would absolutely love Lucius Shepard.
I'm going to write him down in my notes here.
Yeah, you'd love it, especially the early works. I think you'd really get into Green Eyes. But you
I read that one.
You've read that one.
I read that one.
Because it was one of Terry Carr's specials. Then there's the short story collection, The Jaguar Hunter, and there's the amazing novel Life During Wartime, from the Talking Heads song, of course, which is in Gollanc's Masterworks. And, you know, in a way, I would say anybody who's read Shepard, who hasn't read Priest, I mean, you go to the more jungle-based Priest things, and there are a few of them, you know, you would see a connection there. But, you know, it's a book where I don't like to get too rational about it. I'd rather be irrational about it, because it's a book which speaks to the irrational. That's the one, and Life During Wartime is similar. I mean, there's a lot of things in Life During Wartime that don't make a lot of sense. Right. But that's part of the beauty of it. That's why you read these kind of books, to be challenged and to feel this spikiness. And in a way, I wouldn't want to over-explain Indoctrinaire. I think you should just plunge into it, really.
Yeah. It's strange because I started before Richard did, and I read the back, and it talked about on my copy, it talked about time travel. So I texted Richard and said, start it, don't read the back, because I didn't know if you had the same copy as me, because I do feel like this book is best just jumped into. I didn't like knowing what the back told me, that it was time travel.
And I followed your advice on that, and I thank you for that, because I really came into it trying to understand what the zone was. Just the concept that about that 20-page mark of them walking into the future was much better, having not known that part of it.
I really think so. Yeah.
One of the big problems with Chris's books has always been, and I found this in my job as a bookseller, is that you can't talk about them very much. Because it's so easy to give the game away. And that's when I did the video about the glamour, why I stopped all the comments, because people were saying he's talking about the glamour. And I thought somebody's going to do a real spoiler here in a moment. So I pulled all the comments, because it's very much one of those things that with a lot of his work, it's best left unexplained, because part of the joy of it is you finding out. And this is something that people like about Gene Wolfe's work, especially things like Book of the New Sun and 7 Nights in America, and to a degree things like The Hero's Werewolf, is that thing where you have to piece it together. But I think Chris's work it's very profound, because you are talking about the whole idea of solipsism and the fact that all these people, they've been exposed to the gas and the disturbances. And even the people who appear to be the torturers, in Indoctrinaire, as we said earlier on, they're victims as well. Everybody's in their sort of private hell, and it's the way that's spilled out into the whole world, as a result of science. So it's a heck of a warning as well.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like the whole jail sequence, which to me was the core of this, was questioning what it takes to have authority and what it means to not have authority. And I really loved how well Christopher Priest was able to show that authority is almost a state of mind or action that eventually Wentic just takes authority away from Astorde. How do you say his name?
I assume that's how you pronounce it. Astorde.
Okay, Astorde. Yeah, he just assumes all of them are randomly taking on what they think their positions are supposed to be in this jail, but nobody's keeping them in there really. They all just showed up in this jail that is nobody's around, and they all were just like, I guess this is my job. I'm a guard. I'm a prisoner. I'm the interrogator. And slowly the interrogation turns to where it flips, and suddenly Dr. Wentic is interrogating Astorde. It's really, really brilliant because it shows, I felt, kind of how unimportant those roles actually were, that really it was just people in this area trying to create society in a place that there was none. It was really, really brilliantly done. And that's the part that we talked about in Richard's video. That's very Kafkaesque, I think. This idea of, like in the trial, you have the person put on trial and he never knows what his crime is, what he's accused of. And then in the castle, just a bureaucracy nightmare of him trying to meet with the people in the castle. It seems very similar to that. And for me, that was really, like I said, every page was just blowing my mind watching this kind of socialism, not even socialism, this social idea kind of play out, this idea of society, status quo play out and then fall apart as people started stealing each other's so-called positions. I thought it was really brilliant.
There's a sort of game element to that whole sequence where you feel like it's an elaborate game, and people have picked these roles and they're trying to work out what they are, and they've been twisted that way. The disturbances have got to them, and they're in this kind of fugue state. But there's another game going on, which is that I got this the second time I read the book, when Wentic goes into the shed maze and he's crawling around these tunnels, and whenever he gets out, they put him back in. And of course, what Chris did, even in this book and across his career, was he put you into a maze, and when you think you get out of it, he pushed you back in. And he would often do it with a single word, or with an ellipsis, or with a missing word, or with a character. And as you read his book, you'll see he does this time and time again. And sometimes you think, is it just in my head? Then you think, well, it doesn't matter. So the Priestian way of looking at reality is, there's my reality and your reality. Now you're in mine, but it might just be yours, and you might be making all this up yourself. So I think the sort of Kafkaesque thing about Indoctrinaire is inescapable, and that's what makes it such an exciting book to me, I think.
Yeah.
And this is where I have a question, because we go into a very scientific explanation of a post-apocalyptic society who's using time travel to hopefully do something that could change their present reality. That's where we get into that PKD analogy as well. But I kind of was wondering if that cheapened by explaining away all the things that were happening in that prison, if it cheapened it by explaining away with the disturbance drugs, that there had been a mission and that they kind of lost focus of this mission because they were trapped out here. I was hoping it would be a little bit more ambiguous, not explained as much as it was in the second half.
As I said in the other video, he did say that he felt he wished he hadn't put those explanations in, but he decided to let them stay and let them stand, even though the book was shortened. And for me, those are the things which I'm the least comfortable with, because you see him as his work progresses, he starts throwing those things out of the window, and making the ground beneath your feet even shakier. But the result is, if you engage with it, is that they're even more satisfying as books. And one thing about his style, which is similar to Ballard's, is, and people often said, he wasn't a great stylist. Ballard wasn't a great stylist. I disagree. There's a kind of flatness which means that you don't have to be too exhibitionistic to get those effects. And it does make you look at the words more closely. And those explanations, I never think about them when I read it. I get them, but they are more straight ahead SF things, which are more rooted in the genre tradition. And he did come from the genre tradition. I mean, one of my favorite stories by him is the first story, the Run, which is in here in Real Time World, as I say. And in that, he refers to there's a political bloc called the Pan-Asians. And the Pan-Asians, that was something that Heinlein used. I think Heinlein used it in Sixth Column, which is also known as The Day After Tomorrow. I think it's that one. I can't remember. So, he did pick these things up from people like Asimov, Van Vogt, Heinlein, even though, he was never somebody who'd come and say, oh, yeah, I really love that. When he was teaching SF, he was teaching science fiction at North London Poly in the mid-70s. I think Ian Watson, I think maybe Bob Shaw were teaching there as well. I know Ian Watson was. And there's an interview where he said he was teaching Asimov, he was teaching Foundation, and he says, oh, it's marvelous stuff, but when you talk to him, he would never talk about that stuff. I remember saying to him, surely you've read loads of Philip K. Dick? He said, oh yeah, when I was younger in the 60s, I read a few, they were good, So I think there's a whole sort of hidden secret history of Chris as an SF reader, because he discovered it at quite a young age, and he would have read a lot of the classic stuff, and he got onto it very, very quickly indeed. So that is there. So that is probably the weakest part of the book. But, overall, he didn't really go down that route again. And what you were saying, Chris, about authority, funnily enough, in The Run, his first story, which I urge you to read in Real Time World, it's a very short story, it's about 6 pages. And it has a similarity to Indoctrinaire because it's a pre-global war situation. And there's a president or prime minister who's visiting this location in the country where there are rocket planes which are on standby because the Pan-Asians are agitating, and there's the readiness for war. And this president, this leader, is thinking, I don't think we should be spending all this money on this because, do we need to be that ready? And then he gets a call, and today it'd be a mobile phone, but in the story it's called a call kit. It's really sort of primeval, and saying, oh, code 3, what have you, and that means something's happening, and there's going to be a nuclear strike. And then the second part of the story goes into a confrontational thing, which I won't tell you about, but it's got a very doomy feel. That's why I like the story. For all its crudity, it is quite crudely written in parts compared to his later stuff. But there is nothing where he takes on an unsympathetic character, a politician who may well be right-wing, and he does something which a lot of people would consider really heinous. And it does make you think about the world, not just then, but now as well, where there are things going on like the situation with the Ukraine and Putin and Trump and what have you, all that stuff going on. And, the nukes are still there. So it's pretty frightening stuff.
Yeah.
Even his early work remains incredibly relevant. And that's there in Indoctrinaire because, the bioweapons and, the poison gases and that, they're still there. They're still out there. There was stuff used in World War I, like mustard gas, phosgene, which still, is deadly now. It hasn't been superseded. So it does make you think.
Yeah. I wonder if he had to add a lot of the science fiction to this to get it published.
I didn't get that impression.
Okay.
I think, he was published by Faber, and Faber were a very literary house. And Faber, for example, I'm not sure when he died, but this being the Faber original, T.S. Eliot was on the editorial board of Faber.
Oh,
he was
wow.
one of the directors. So, Faber were well known for being a very literary house, but they did a lot of SF at the time. They published Zelazny in the UK. A lot of people, there was a thing in the mid-70s called the Faber Mafia. There's a video about it on my channel where there's a handful of people. There's Priest, Robert Holdstock, Gary Kilworth, Christopher Evans, and Faber did a lot of work with SF, and they were all unceremoniously dropped in 1981 when the guy who championed them moved away from that. And in Tony Faber's book about Faber, he says we used to do a lot with SF, but that's not going to be in this book because it's about Faber now, and yet it's supposed to be history of Faber. So it's kind of the past being rewritten. It's bizarre. So I don't think he did. I think he felt he might have had to do that for commercial reasons, but there's no definite.
So not from the publishers, but maybe from the public.
Possibly he felt he had to do those things. Yeah.
I think it was even himself. I think he kind of had a foot in both worlds. Some of the very traditional kind of an SF type of a structure, and this more of a, let's call it the new wave structure potentially here. And I think that as I've read only 2 more novels of his, I think I've seen them meld better. And so that there's a more ambiguity there instead of a more, in this one, I feel, explaining away what has happened. And I think that really touches to what Steve was talking about there too.
Yeah, that doesn't happen later on. It doesn't even happen in the second novel. I mean, by the time you get the second novel, he's dispensed with that kind of thing altogether. It's in some of the early stories, especially more conventional ones, but it's not in any of the other novels. I mean, when you get to Fugue for a Darkling Island, I mean, that has a non-linear structure, and it also has a missing part. He told me there was a missing part. He also said there was another part which was put in like a joker in a pack of cards to upset everything. So no matter how you tried, you couldn't make it fit together. So he's told both of those stories, and either neither or both are true. And again, that was the heart of what he was about. What is real? How can we claim that there's anything is solid, that nothing can melt into air? And of course, in Indoctrinaire, an awful lot of stuff does melt into the air.
Yeah.
And you know what? With Inverted World, he does still give us an explanation for something that is so absurd all the way through. So there is still that idea of, I'm going to still connect in a way, but I'm not going to give you all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a weird thing, and this is going really deep in. There was an awful lot of people questioning Dr. Wentick's nationality, and people continuously claiming he's American, and him constantly correcting them and saying, no, I am from the UK, even to the extent of, in the very end, he's with what was that guy's name? The main
Musgrove was the guy who brought him back to the future.
Not Musgrove.
No? Okay.
Musgrove was the assistant of this guy. Let's see.
Oh yeah, the guy from the society that he finally got to.
Yeah, the Brazilian guy.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's on the plane and he's like, my wife and kids. And he's like, whoa, wait a minute. You have a wife and kids? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, we thought you were living alone in like Minneapolis. And he's like, no, I'm from the UK. And I found that really interesting because for one part, I was like, okay, it's just a uniqueness of the character that he's putting into but it's strange that I feel like he even started making us question whether or not this character had a wife and kids in the UK. And of course, I think he did, because it ended with him trying to find them. But it was weird that I felt like everything that was written about this wife and kids seemed mysterious to an extent that made me question him and their existence.
My read on that, though, was that they had limited records.
Right.
That they were trying to find him. And so the only records they really had were from the Pentagon, of him having this short stint in Minneapolis, I think it was, in the university. And
before
then
Antarctica,
in the Arctic concentration area.
Yeah.
And so that limited record is why that happened. But the question you're asking, and I think is very significant, is why were those details there in that way, sort of divorcing him from his family, which he had been basically kidnapped by the U.S. government away from his family. He wasn't allowed to return or even connect with them at points.
Yeah.
So there is that dissonance there.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of Orwellian because it speaks really to the idea of the Anglosphere as being politically or militarily united through things like the Commonwealth and what have you. And of course, Priest was a huge fan of Orwell. Read all his work.
Oh.
And, the shadow of 1984 falls over it, where, of course, the UK was just airstrip one. And the idea that, how does a British scientist get involved in something like the concentration down in the Antarctic? There's a common enemy, maybe. And that thing about secret identity, black ops. So there are these kind of elements from spy fiction as well.
Yeah.
And the other day I was watching on TV, something popped up on, I think it was on Amazon Prime, was the feature film of Alistair MacLean's novel, The Satanberg. I don't know if you've ever seen The Satanberg. And it was made in the early 60s. And it's about a German warfare crisis. And if you haven't seen it, check it out. I saw it as a kid and it had a big impact on me. And a lot of it takes place at a secret facility in a desert. And I was watching it and I was thinking, and I was enjoying, the cinematography and hadn't seen it for a long time. And then I thought, my God, Indoctrinaire, so there is kind of a almost a tongue-in-cheek spy fiction thing, slightly there in Indoctrinaire. Because, of course, in Britain at that time, people like Len Deighton, John le Carré were absolutely massive bestsellers. Ian Fleming, obviously. The spy novel in its classic genre form is pretty much a British form. Yeah. So it's almost kind of nods to that as well, I think, in Indoctrinaire.
Yeah, and the tensions of that Cold War. I don't think people nowadays really kind of get how at least when Stephen and I were growing up, that was huge. The tension that you kept feeling about how close we are to midnight, to ultimate destruction of the world.
We had it in the 80s
hung
too.
Over you.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop you. I just
that was actually my point. I was just going to end it there, but I think that is part of this as well, in terms of the motivation to try to come back in time to get Dr. Wentic, is they wanted to find a way to prevent the nuclear apocalypse from happening.
Yeah,
and that gives us there are so many novels from the 60s that ended with these very poignant scenes at the end. Some people would call them downers, but I love those dark type of doomed endings, and this novel gives us that too in terms of Wentic's storyline.
Yeah, that's actually the last thing I wanted to talk about for the deep dive is this choice that the character makes at the end. I mean, this Brazilian future looked pretty dang good for him, and he straight up chose to not get on the plane that would take him to the future. He chose to stay in England where the bombs had just fallen, and he was staring at the war, and he chose to sit by the tree and I assume probably die instead of go to this future where he had already found a female companion, we'll say. I don't know, girlfriend's the right word, but yeah, he had already really started to experience a good life that he could have in the future, and he chose his life. And I thought that was really an interesting choice.
The question of choice in the face of apocalypse becomes very, very relevant in his next novel, Fig for Darkening Island. I won't say any more of that, but the central protagonist of that has to make choices, and it's his inability to make choices in the face of a apocalyptic situation, and whether he is being a moral coward or whether we would all shrink from those choices is a key question in Fugue. And it's a question which is incredibly germane now, as you'll see when you read the novel, because it is incredibly prophetic, even more so than some aspects of Indoctrinaire. And I'm not going to say any more about it there, because, again, it's a book which mustn't have any spoilers. So there you go.
And you know what? You brought up that character who is a female companion to Dr. Wentic in Brazil, and he has this... He feels like he's cheating on his wife and kid who died 200 years in the past.
Right.
And in this tiny short novel, it brought in a human complexity that was a very side note, but I found it really brought some depth again to Wenticke's character.
Yeah.
It really does ground things. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the thing with Chris. He was because he had the virtues from early on of the mainstream novelist, and because he was interested in the mainstream novel character, he could ground things with little things like that, little strokes that was just so effective, and that you almost didn't notice, but by the end of the book, you'd feel that. I mean, Bob Shaw was really good at that as well. I mean, Bob Shaw was great at that. And that's something I think the British SF writers of that period are particularly excellent at.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back from their reading of John Wyndham and H.G. Wells, personally.
Yeah.
I think
And I can't forget that Chris was 27 at the publication. So he's been writing this probably when he was 25 and 26. That's a lot of depth for a young man at that age. I certainly didn't have that.
No.
Yeah,
No, and it's interesting because when you look at the novel from a character arc point of view, he starts with not being able to actually solve whatever it is he's trying to do as a scientist. He fails at that. And then when you go through, he literally fails at being a prisoner. He is sent to the future to fix what he made, and he's like, I didn't even make this gas. And so he's like, I'm not important. You want this other guy. And he goes back to get that other guy, fails at that. Then he's like, I'm going to go save my family. And his buddy from the future is like, easy. Yeah, we'll go. You tell us where to go. And he fails at that. And in the end, I felt like he was just like done. I feel like he was done. I think he felt like that he was constantly misunderstood as to his importance. And I think that in the end, he felt that and truly with his family, and you see this in the novel, it's very painful, that he had betrayed his family for all these weird places and things he's supposed to be. This brilliant scientist in Antarctica, this brilliant scientist that invented a war gas that he's got to fix for Brazil, and so on and so forth. And that in the end, he doesn't feel like he's given anything. Yeah. It's kind of how I took it.
And sitting against that tree, that imagery, I can think of Jonah at Nineveh in the Bible, or of Job and all the things that he's gone through. And there's a point where he's sitting against a tree. Like, it's a very iconic kind of visual image of a person who's resigned to what has happened.
Yeah.
Something that I get out of a lot of his early work is, and this is a biblical thing, and it's not really present there, but when you said that, Richard, it flashed on it. You just get the feeling that a lot of the characters, the focus characters, they're at points very often when, rather like Lot's wife, where they want to look back, but they dare not.
Right.
And, usually they look back.
Yeah.
The consequences, are writ large through the rest of the stories in the novel. So, but yeah, it's amazing stuff. I mean, I still love it. I've read it many times. And it is a book which I would go back to just to savor that incredible strangeness. And talking to you both today, the richness of it obviously is not just in my head, it's obviously in yours too. So.
I wanted to show a couple of things just really quick, and then I think we'll wrap up. I always like to do this. This reminded me a little bit structurally of Stanislaw Lem's The Futurological Congress. Just in the sense that that felt like there was really two parts. One was kind of absurdist, and one was very direct science fiction. I feel like they were kind of writing in a similar fashion. And then this one is more similar, and you've already brought him up a couple of times, Steve. Night Walk by Bob Shaw, I think, follows this in a really interesting way from a more kind of action sci-fi perspective, but he goes to this jail that's unescapable and has to walk through the jungle to get out, and then it has this huge science fiction ending with great consequences. These two seem very similar.
He literally has to see through the eyes of others to do it, which is another example of Shaw's genius. And I'm sure I mentioned in one of my videos that he he referred to physics a lot. He referred to optics 3 times. Night Walk in A Wreath of Stars, and obviously in the wonderful Slow Glass stories in Other Days, Other Eyes. And I thought that was really original, and that was typical of how, again, even a British hard SF writer in that period would see the metaphoric virtues of seeing through somebody else's eyes.
The one that I kept coming to was Camp Concentration by Thomas M. Dish, and I felt like the very first half of the novel for here was very similar in some ways or interesting in some ways to that. Dish goes in a complete direction where it just the character completely is losing it, but here we go in a direction of a little bit more explaining what happens. But I've been very curious to see. You were talking about Thomas M. Dish being in London at that time. It would have been very curious to see if they had sat down and had a pint together and were talking about some of these things.
They did, they obviously did, because at that point in London, Dish was there, Sladek was there, Norman Spinrad was there, Delaney was there for a while. It's easier actually to count the people who weren't there. I think James Saddis was there. The people who weren't there, Ellison didn't visit the UK till the mid 70s, but the people who were the new wave writers who were in New Worlds, both American and British, they were all there. And there was a pub, I think it was, what was it called? I can't think it was called, the White Horse maybe, where British SF fans had gathered for decades and decades. So these guys were doing this stuff, they hung out together. So it is quite interesting. If only we could go back in time with one of our cameras and pick up on some of those conversations. Wouldn't that be great? But,
or if we had either of these two writers to ask that question of.
There's not many left, and some of them don't like to talk about these things, So there you go. But whenever I talk to Michael Moorcock or John Harrison, I'll try and get a bit more out of them next time.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you guys very much for joining me. I think that's all I really had for the deep dive.
I think you had plenty.
All right.
Thank you, Chris. I don't normally go into the deep dive of novels because I'm trying not to spoil them, but this is a lot of fun to just be able to chat about the different aspects.
I really enjoy them. They're my favorite to do as deep dives, more than reviews, but you got to do both. All right. Steve, you want to tell us what people can expect on your channel coming up?
Okay, well, we're going to have a little discussion which is entirely unplanned in the manner of Indoctrinaire, where none of us know what we're doing, and we'll take on different roles, about science fiction and the counterculture in the 60s, whether we think science fiction changed the counterculture, whether the counterculture changed science fiction, and I'm going to throw a few famous examples in, and we'll just see what comes out of it. So that's going to be a nice little round-robin chat about those kind of things.
Fantastic. And if you haven't watched us doing the review of Indoctrinaire on Richard Rempel's channel, go give that a watch, and we will see you next time.